As the international community watches developments in Damascus closely, questions are arising about Syria's path forward. The international community is grappling with the future of its political process. With Egypt calling for unity and a comprehensive settlement, can Security Council Resolution 2254 pave the way for stability amid ongoing humanitarian and political challenges? Can the country rebuild while ensuring unity, justice, and the protection of all its citizens? Al-Sharq al-Awsat has reported that the United Nations Security Council has called for a Syrian-led political process to chart the country's future, emphasizing the importance of national sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. The statement supports a roadmap for peace, urging the establishment of a new constitution and UN-monitored elections, with efforts facilitated by the United Nations. The Council also stressed the importance of combating terrorism, especially Daesh, and upholding human rights and humanitarian access. It reaffirmed support for the UNDOF peacekeeping force that monitors the Israeli-Syrian border and ensures compliance with the 1974 disengagement agreement. The head of the UN Migration Agency, Amy Pope, expressed cautious optimism after meeting Syria's new caretaker government. She acknowledged the enormous challenges ahead, but also emphasized the need for international support as the country faces a major rebuilding effort following the fall of the previous regime. And to provide more analysis on the recent political happenings in Syria, joining us from Cairo, Dr. Mohammed Osman, an international relations specialist, and Dr. Hamid Faris, an international relations professor. And a very warm welcome to both our guests. And Dr. Osman, what are the primary internal political challenges faced by the Syrian government today, and how are those shaping its governance strategies, sir?
Thank you for having me, Rana.
It's our utmost pleasure, sir.
Right now, Syria is facing a very acute period of its history, and its destiny and its future will be determined by a sound political transition. And that explains why the United Nations Security Council and all the international and regional actors are very focused on establishing an orderly transition that takes into account the aspirations of all segments of Syrian society and the Syrian political spectrum. However, there are concerns that this might not be the case at the moment. The current transitional government was unilaterally appointed by Ahmed al-Shara, also known as Abu Muhammad al-Julani, and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, his political faction or his armed faction that came to power through force after the fall of the Assad regime. And this new transitional government is completely dominated by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and is headed by one of its members. And also, they have decided to appoint an assembly or a committee to amend the current Syrian constitution. And of course, to my knowledge and to everyone's knowledge, this is not being done in consultation with any other Syrian actors. And this raises significant concerns because the focus of the entire political transition has to determine a certain constitutional framework that is reached through consensus to govern Syria through in the coming years, and also the rebuilding and the rehabilitation of state institutions. And we do not see that happening anytime soon in the current polarized circumstances within Syria itself. And also elections have to be held in which all of Syria's political forces can participate and have a fair chance in running and gaining representation, and as well the representation of the ethnic and religious minorities. These are very strong challenges, and it does not seem that the new government in Syria is focusing on tackling them. And the transition they are putting in place, which is a bit dubious and foggy at the moment, does not have any clear signs of being inclusive or overreaching across the entire diverse political and societal spectrum of Syria itself. And I think that the United Nations and the Arab League and the regional powers like Turkey and Jordan and Syria and Iraq have to encourage the current government to pursue this trajectory that will prevent Syria from descending into any potential internal conflict again in the future.
Sir, do you see that there is a possibility that Syria will not descend, or there is anything that will prevent Syria from descending at this point?
The only thing that will prevent Syria from descending into another civil war is an orderly political transition and creating a space through which all Syrians can express themselves in a democratic country based on civic principles. However, if they Yes, please go ahead.
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah. So if this is not achieved, then we are facing the risk of descending into another civil war.
Perfect, sir. Do you foresee this coming?
I cannot say for sure. However, since we are not so far, we have not the Syrian government, the current Syrian government, has not adopted this sound inclusive transition, then I think the chances of sliding back into internal conflict and open hostilities are substantially considerable.
Okay, Dr. Faris, welcome to the show. How have external powers from your own, sir, narrative shaped Syria's political landscape, and how sustainable is their influence in the long term, sir? Sir, again, how have external powers shaped Syria's political landscape, and how sustainable is their influence in the long term?
In fact, Syria, of course, has fallen prey to foreign interventions. And all the factions inside Syria which ousted the regime in Syria have close affinities and connections with external forces. And they want to have and maintain influence inside Syria. We are observing a lot of complex variables, specifically in in light of the presence of the United States and all the other foreign parties that all of, in addition, of course, to internal Syrian factions and the 60 military militant factions inside Syria, all of these parties that I have just mentioned have their own specific agendas in order to, which actually undermines the consolidation and the integrity of the Syrian state. As well, Israel plays a pivotal role in the political scene in Syria because Syria or Israel has tried to recolonize the Syrian Golan and as well tried to colonize Al-Qunaitira villages and the adjacent villages. And it has suspended the disengagement agreement between Israel and the Syrian state. And in fact, this agreement was carried out under the auspices of the Soviet Union and the United States and the United Nations. But Israel just violates, or we find Israel just violating the provisions of this disagreement and just tries to undermine the Syrian government and its consolidated territorial integrity by destroying the military capacities of the regular Syrian army. And in fact, on the other hand, we see regarding the Turkish side to the north of Syria, the Turkish side has tried to expand its presence in the northern buffer zone.
Okay, sir, I'll leave it here and I'll go back to Dr. Osman again. Dr. Osman, how do you assess Egypt's role in supporting stability and security for the Syrian people, especially through its diplomatic efforts and humanitarian initiatives?
Egypt, in contrast to many other regional actors, including Israel and to a lesser extent Turkey, is keen on supporting the stability and the unity of the Syrian state and, of course, the well-being of the Syrian people. This has been expressed openly and clearly by His Excellency President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in his meeting with prominent media figures and the head of the State Information Service about 48 hours ago. And he clearly said that the Syrian people are the ones who determine the future of their country. And it's up to them to protect their own country and choose the sound pathway to stability and prosperity. And I think this is very sound because at heart, Egypt supports and respects Syria's sovereignty and adopts a policy of non-intervention. And I think Egypt's interaction with the Syrian crisis is completely and entirely through a collective Arab action, and this collective Arab action is embodied by the Arab Liaison Committee of the Arab League, which convened recently in Aqaba, and they have released a huge statement with about 15 or 20 points that basically put the way forward towards the Arab vision for Syria's stability. And I think in the core of that was supporting Syria's stability, supporting Syria's unity and sovereignty, and opposing any expansionist actions by any regional powers, especially Israel, that threaten Syria's unity or Syria's sovereignty and security. This basically is Egypt's stance and position on Syria. And I think that from here onwards, Egypt will keep adopting this policy and will be keen on mobilizing support of other Arab countries and the international community to support these very sound goals.
Perfect. Dr. Faris, what efforts can Egypt make to help Syria become stable and emerge from the transitional phase safely?
Egypt, in fact, has a clear roadmap to support and foster the Syrian state. And Egypt has reiterated over and over again that there has to be a Syrian solution or resolution, rather, for the Syrian crisis. And in fact, or however, there are some other issues regarding the Syrian regime. You know, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is still classified as a terrorist organization by the United Nations and the United States. But the way out of this crisis is for a constitutional committee to be formed, a committee that comprises all, or a representation of all Syrian factions and parties, in order to operationalize the resolution number 1952. And in fact, if the Syrian regime is going to get out of the political landscape, voting can take place, or an election can take place in a constitutional manner under the auspices of this committee, in order for Syria to become a state with territorial integrity without a lot of factions and fragmentation in the inside.
Dr. Osman, how has the prolonged conflict affected the social cohesion of Syrian communities, especially regarding internal displacement and rebuilding trust again, sir? And of course, in light of foreign intervention, as Dr. Faris mentioned, and of course the factions in Syria, and of course the interference and existence of the United States and other countries.
Of course, I have to say I agree. I will start with agreeing entirely with what Dr. Faris has said in his previous answers to your questions regarding the deconstructive element or the deconstructive role of foreign intervention or foreign meddling inside Syria over its 13-year.
Sir, this is the main threat that's facing and challenges that are facing Syria at this point.
Anyone with an honest heart and a sound mind would come to this conclusion, I believe. So, and of course, Syria's 13-year-long conflict has left the country in tatters. We have about 13 million people displaced. About 7 million of them are displaced internally, and about 6 million people are displaced externally as refugees in many countries around the world and in the region. So 7 million displaced people inside Syria. About 50% of the country's basic infrastructure has been destroyed, and the state has collapsed with the fall of the Assad regime. So with taking that into account, we have to understand that now Syria is struggling to provide its citizens with the most basic services. So now this compounded humanitarian situation, if it's not dealt with urgently by the international community and by prominent regional forces that do have significant influence inside Syria, then the chances of Syria descending back into civil war become much more probable. And the extreme humanitarian situation, especially in terms of food security and homelessness and displacement and the lack of basic infrastructure like water and electricity in many parts of Syria, will definitely make the dire living conditions proponents of further instability inside Syria. And all of this cannot be achieved without an orderly political transition, as we have mentioned before, that is inclusive to all Syrians, to eliminate all the potential causes of civil conflict again.
Okay, dear guests, please excuse me before we continue. Let's explore UN Resolution 2254, which may offer a roadmap for peace in Syria, although geopolitical tensions and violence continue to complicate its implementation.
The United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254, adopted unanimously on December 18, 2015, outlines a roadmap for a peaceful resolution to the Syrian conflict. The resolution calls for an immediate ceasefire, the establishment of a transitional government, and free, fair elections under UN supervision. It emphasizes the need for a Syrian-led political process and highlights the importance of combating terrorism, particularly groups like Daesh and Al-Nusra Front. Despite its ambitious framework, implementing Resolution 2254 has faced significant challenges. Various international actors have expressed differing views on its feasibility. The UN Special Envoy for Syria has repeatedly stressed the need for all parties to engage constructively, while some analysts argue that geopolitical rivalries between the US, Russia, Iran, and Turkey hinder progress. Russia, a key ally of the former Syrian government, supports the resolution but insists on the primacy of Syrian sovereignty. Meanwhile, the current transitional government demands more concrete steps toward political transition and accountability. Recent developments in Syria highlight the complexities of implementation. The conflict remains active in parts of the country, with renewed clashes in Idlib and northern Syria. Humanitarian conditions continue to deteriorate, exacerbated by economic sanctions and infrastructure damage. Additionally, the rise of extremist activities further complicates ceasefire efforts. While Resolution 2254 remains a cornerstone for peace, achieving its goals requires greater international consensus and genuine political will among Syrian stakeholders. The situation in Syria remains fluid, and the international community faces the ongoing challenge of balancing humanitarian needs with political negotiations to end the decade-long conflict.
Welcome back again, Dr. Osman and Dr. Faris. Dr. Osman, do you believe the United Nations framework under Resolution 2254 still offers a viable path forward for political transition, or is it an alternative approach needed?
In essence, it is a sound, it does provide a good, wide and vague framework. However, the resolution in its details is not entirely applicable. The resolution was issued in 2015 by the UN Security Council, and it was corresponding to a reality in Syria that does not exist anymore. So it does not correspond to the current realities on the ground.
It does not correspond anymore, sir, to the current situation that's taking place in Syria.
Yes, for a simple reason, that is that the Syrian regime of President Bashar al-Assad does not exist anymore. So even the mechanisms that came as a consequence, like, for example, the political dialogue between the opposition and the regime and the constituent assembly or the constituent committee to form a constitution, which exists until now, by the way, it's a 150 members committee, 50% appointed by the government, the former Syrian government that is, and 50 appointed by the opposition and 50 chosen by the United Nations representing Syrian civil society. This formula does not exist anymore. So the resolution needs to be updated in order so that it can ensure an orderly political transition. And also something else, the resolution has, when it called for a halt of hostilities or a cessation of hostilities, it excluded two elements or two factions from the ceasefire arrangements. And those were ISIS, of course, and Jabhat al-Nusra, which became later on Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the current governing force. And why? Because the UN considers these two movements a terrorist organization. Now HTS is the governing force inside Syria, led by Mr. Ahmad al-Shara, who is also classified as a terrorist. So right now, the HTS has to be removed.
Okay, sir, do you think that the, of course, request by the HTS to be out of the terrorist organizations will be implemented?
It's quite logical that they
and
would
their
ask for
frozen funds will all their calls will be taken into consideration.
I think this is being considered right now at least by the United States and several European countries, because HTS is the de facto governing force in Syria. This is something that we have to live with.
So we have to abide to this fact.
What? Excuse me?
We have to abide to this fact that it's going to happen.
We have to deal with this fact, not necessarily abide by it or accept it, but they have to deal with it, meaning that right now Mr. Shara and his movement are emanating the right messages that the West wants to hear. And I think this is coordinated, and they are being obedient and cooperative with Western countries at the moment. So I foresee that this will happen, and it's logical to request their removal from the list, and it's logical as well to amend the resolution 2254 either through another resolution or through an agreement reached under the auspices of the United Nations in order to pave the way, as we spoke before, for an orderly political transition that is inclusive. And this will even any pretexts HTS might use in order to subvert or sabotage such a pathway that has been endorsed by the UN. The pretext usually would be, while resolution 2254 is outdated and it's not applicable anymore. So we need to update this resolution through the same consensus.
Dr. Osman, sorry to interrupt you, but while you say that it's not applicable anymore, it's still, we just read in a report now that while resolution 2254 remains a cornerstone for peace, achieving its goals requires greater international consensus and genuine political will among Syrian stakeholders, sir. your narrative.
It is a cornerstone, yes. You cannot, in a building, you have a cornerstone, 4 cornerstones, and then you have the pillars and the 4 walls and the ceiling. So a cornerstone in itself is not sufficient. So yes, it's a cornerstone that needs to be built upon. How do we build upon it? By updating and developing Resolution 2254, by changing some of its provisions so that it can correspond, including the time frame of a political transition. It said that 18-month elections should be held in 2015. 2015 was not 18 months ago. 2015 was 9 years ago.
Okay.
So now we need
Dr. Mohammed, because I have to wrap up, I want to ask Dr. Faris, how do you perceive the influence of regional and global competition on Syria's reintegration into the Arab system, especially its position within the Arab League, sir?
Syria has definitely transformed into an international conflict battlefield. In fact, we cannot draw a line between what's happening in Syria and what's happening in Ukraine and Russia and the West in general. The repercussions of the Syrian crisis has had its negative consequences on the Middle East, and there were a lot of efforts in the past to minimize the Russian influence in the region, because there is a perpetuation and expansion of the conflict between Iran and the Syrian side, and we have observed that the influence of the United States has been decreasing in the Arab world and in a lot of other spots in the Arab region. In fact, we have right now around 105 military spots in Syria that have been minimized, and but still there is the Kartus base and another base that are up and running. The conflict is still ongoing, and I believe that the conflict is going to get more
Dr.
and more
Faris,
exacerbated.
sorry, because I'm running out of time and I have to wrap up this episode. That was Dr. Mohammed Osman, an international relations specialist, and Dr. Hamid Faris, international relations professor from Cairo. Thank you very much for your valuable insights and for your informative knowledge. That brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more updates on Qnews.